Former President Donald Trump has consistently maintained that the ongoing war in Ukraine could have been averted. He argues that Ukraine missed an opportunity to negotiate with Russia before the conflict escalated. Trump believes that a deal could have been struck, preventing the immense suffering and destruction that has unfolded over the past 3 years. He has not, however, specified the exact parameters of such a deal. This stance has drawn both support and criticism from various quarters. Trump's critics, however, argue that his assessment is simplistic and ignores the complex geopolitical realities at play. They point to Russia's long-standing ambition to regain control over Ukraine and its history of aggression against its neighbors. They argue that Putin's ultimate goal was always a full-scale invasion, making any pre-war concessions by Ukraine irrelevant. Furthermore, they highlight Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 as evidence of its expansionist intentions, which predate the current conflict. Trump's supporters counter that his experience in deal-making and his understanding of global power dynamics make him uniquely qualified to assess the situation. They point to his successful negotiations with North Korea as evidence of his ability to achieve breakthroughs in seemingly intractable conflicts. They believe that his approach, which prioritizes direct engagement and a willingness to compromise, could have yielded a different outcome in Ukraine. The debate over whether Ukraine could have avoided the war through negotiation is likely to continue. It raises fundamental questions about the nature of international relations, the role of diplomacy, and the responsibility of individual leaders in preventing conflict. As the war rages on, the search for a peaceful resolution remains elusive, leaving the world to grapple with the consequences of this devastating conflict. Trump has been openly critical of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's leadership throughout the conflict. He has labeled Zelensky as grossly incompetent and a poor negotiator, suggesting that a different leader could have secured a more favorable outcome for Ukraine. Trump has frequently questioned Zelensky's ability to effectively govern and represent the interests of the Ukrainian people. Adding fuel to the fire, Trump has advocated for holding elections in Ukraine as part of any diplomatic resolution to the conflict. This suggestion aligns with demands from Moscow, which has sought to portray Zelensky's government as illegitimate. Trump has repeatedly cast doubt on Zelensky's popularity, citing a purportedly low approval rating of 4%, a figure contradicted by independent polls showing significantly higher levels of support. Trump's questioning of Zelensky's legitimacy and his push for new elections have been met with sharp criticism from Ukraine and its Western allies. They argue that such calls undermine Ukrainian sovereignty and play into Russia's narrative of a divided and dysfunctional Ukraine. They maintain that Zelensky was democratically elected and enjoys broad support among the Ukrainian population. Furthermore, they argue that holding elections in the midst of a war, with millions displaced and Russian forces occupying significant portions of Ukrainian territory, would be logistically impossible and inherently unfair. They view Trump's stance as an attempt to legitimize Russia's invasion and undermine the Ukrainian government's efforts to defend its territorial integrity. In a move that has raised eyebrows across the globe, the United States and Russia recently held negotiations in Saudi Arabia aimed at finding a path to end the war in Ukraine. However, the talks were notable for the absence of key stakeholders, Ukraine itself and European nations heavily invested in Ukraine's defense. This exclusion has sparked concerns among European leaders, who fear that the United States might be willing to make concessions to Russia at the expense of Ukraine's sovereignty and security. Trump, for his part, has mocked Zelensky for not being present at these talks, further fueling criticism of his approach to the conflict. He has suggested that Zelensky's absence highlights his lack of leadership and diplomatic skills. This stance has done little to assuage European anxieties, which are rooted in historical experience with Russian aggression and a deep commitment to upholding the principles of international law and territorial integrity. European leaders have emphasized the need for a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, one that upholds the country's sovereignty and territorial integrity. They argue that any attempt to appease Russia or force Ukraine into concessions under duress would set a dangerous precedent and embolden further aggression in the future. They have called for a united front against Russian aggression and continued support for Ukraine's right to self-determination. The exclusion of Ukraine and European nations from the US-Russia talks has highlighted the complexities of the diplomatic efforts to end the war. It has also exposed divisions within the international community regarding the best approach to resolving the conflict and the level of concessions, if any, that should be demanded from Ukraine. Trump has repeatedly expressed confidence in his ability to negotiate a deal with Russian President Vladimir Putin. He has claimed that Putin wants to end the savage barbarianism in Ukraine and that he is the only one who can bring him to the negotiating table. To this end, Trump has proposed the deployment of European peacekeepers to Ukraine, suggesting that such a force could help stabilize the situation and create conditions for a lasting peace. However, Trump's proposal has been met with skepticism and outright rejection from various quarters. Firstly, Russia has categorically ruled out accepting any NATO peacekeeping forces in Ukraine, viewing them as a threat to its interests. This stance significantly diminishes the feasibility of Trump's proposal, as any peacekeeping force would require Russian consent to operate effectively. Furthermore, critics argue that Trump's proposal ignores the root causes of the conflict, particularly Russia's annexation of Crimea and its support for separatists in eastern Ukraine. They argue that simply deploying peacekeepers without addressing these underlying issues would only serve to freeze the conflict in place, rather than achieving a genuine and lasting resolution. Trump's stance on Ukraine has drawn sharp criticism from former officials and experts, who accuse him of echoing Russian propaganda and downplaying the severity of the conflict. They argue that his focus on negotiations and concessions undermines Ukraine's right to self-defense and ignores Russia's responsibility for the war. The debate over the best way to achieve peace in Ukraine continues to rage on, with no clear end in sight.